Our speaker today is called Dr. Murifu Alphonse. Most of you know him. He's a very renowned lecturer, very kind guy, intelligent, and his CV, you don't want me to start. Do you? It's a long one. But trust me, you will learn a lot. I learned from him, and we trust him. He's a very renowned, he's the principal of the campus College of Art and Social Sciences at the University of Rwanda. But he's also a lecturer, as I said. He had an internship with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and he wrote a lot on the international humanitarian law. So you're going to hear from him. Ask him as many questions as you can. He will answer your questions. Thank you so much. So, sir, without more delay, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good evening. I think it is already an evening. I will not try to divert from what the head of the delegation just mentioned, that there are no clear-cut opinions or the situations the way they are today is not something that you would have a straightforward answer. I'm educated in public international law. I sometimes tend to say that I write about transitional justice as a hobby. And my role is just to stimulate the conversation about the topic. I can see it is a group of diverse people with diverse backgrounds, so I will attempt to be a little bit detailed, but also general, in the sense that we will have ample time for discussion. So the application of international humanitarian law is both a question that is straightforward, that needs straightforward answers, but is also a controversial one in answering the question of what is war, how it is regulated, how is international humanitarian law regulating, who is IHL regulating, what is IHL regulating, and when does it apply. Then I will attempt to discuss what I consider to be some controversial aspects of it. Let me begin by assuming that we all know that laws of war are divided into three categories. The laws of going to war, commonly referred to in Latin as jus ad bellum, a right to war, which is a set of criteria that to be considered before a state or an armed conflict, an armed group engages in war, in order to determine whether entering into war is permissible. This is whether it is a just war or not. This is part of laws of war that you find in the UN Charter, in particular in Article 22, Paragraph 4, and Article 51, where in Article 2, Paragraph 4, it is prohibited, states are prohibited to use force or threat of use of force against other states. But this does not mean that states are prohibited to defend themselves individually or collectively, or when the UN Security Council authorizes the use of force for the purposes of maintaining international peace and security. So that is the first body of laws of war. The second one is about the laws of fighting, what is commonly referred to in Latin as jus in bello, or the international humanitarian law, which is the law that governs the way in which warfare is conducted. It is about the means and methods of fighting, requiring distinction between combatants and non-combatants. It intends to limit the effects or the suffering resulting from the war. This can be taken together with the Hague Conventions, which mainly talks about the conduct of warfare or hostilities, but when it comes to protection of civilians, since by that time there was no any convention that protected civilians, you can refer to what is often called the Martin's Clause, where it says that whatever that is not regulated is under the regulation of public conscience. The third part of laws of war is jus post bellum, justice after the war, which is concerned with how conflicts are ended. There is no treaty at the moment that regulates that part of laws of war. The only reference can be found in peace treaties and the practices on how conflicts have been ending throughout the history. So war or collective conflict is part of human nature that predates our historical records, and it has taken different roles and understandings throughout history. When you read about the history of wars, especially the European history, up to until 1600, war was seen as a law enforcing mechanism. Francisco Suarez, a Spanish Jesuit priest, philosopher, and theologian, writes that in the world as a whole, there must, in order that the various states may dwell in concord, some power for the punishment of injuries inflicted by one state upon another. And this power is not to be found in any superior, for we assume that these states have no commonly acknowledged superior, for we assume that these states, For we assume that these states have no commonly acknowledged superior, therefore the power in question must reside in the sovereign prince of the injured state. And consequently, war has been instituted in place of a tribunal administering just punishment. It moved from being a form of administering justice to a state policy, and we see rebirth of just war arguments in the 20th century. First major characteristics of war is that it is a collective endeavor. As Neff notes, the single most obvious and widely agreed feature of war throughout its long-haul history has been its character as a public and collective enterprise, allying a whole people against a foreign foe. It is a struggle by a society as a whole, authorized and commanded by public authorities, and designed to further the overall corporate interest of the community. The war is directed against another collective entity, initially a state. But today, with the civil wars, with rebel groups or community-based militia groups such as Mai Mai and terrorist groups, this makes the categories of potential belligerents significantly diverse. Another feature or characteristic of the war is that it has always been governed or rule enterprise. War to take place needs some chain of command, enforcing discipline and obedience. All these are only possible where those involved have some rules to respect and ways to enforce those rules to ensure that there is obedience of those rules. In Rwandan tradition, for example, I hope that some of you are aware of that, a king would not wage a war before going to a witch doctor, what is called kuraguza, to ask if the war will be in the favor of Rwanda. You also probably know or have heard about abatabazi b'abacengeri, where Rwandans believed that igihugu umunyarwanda ameneye amaraso kiba gitsinzwe. So if a Rwandan innocent from especially the royal family would spill his or her blood, but at that time it was he. In another country, it meant that that country would be defeated. So war is not a conduct of mere brutality and senseless warmongers. It calls for higher degree of rationality and rule binding. Throughout all traditions, there was what was allowed and not allowed during the war. Women and children, elderly, clergy, or the weak in the enemy societies, for example, would not be a subject of attack. Women and children could not be killed, but may be taken as hostages as part of the routine. These practices are found in all societies, as I had indicated from here in Rwanda. You can go to India, or you can talk of the Greek tradition. The belief has always been the same. War should be waged with at least a certain degree of moderation. The international humanitarian law, what is often called the Geneva Law, revolutionized the laws of fighting because it does not see conflicts as a collusion between rival interests, but rather as a human tragedy. Because, as I said, its intention is to limit the effects and suffering that come out of the armed conflict. Therefore, it sees the laws of war as a restraint rather than a privilege. And this is why interpretation of international humanitarian rules is strict, unlike, for example, the human rights laws, where the application can be sometimes ignored or contextualized. IHL applies to situations of armed conflict, but currently concerning different actors and diverse set of conflicts, it is very difficult to understand the limitations of the kinds of conflicts IHL relates to. But still the principle remains, regardless of this diversity, IHL treats all its subjects as equals. The way it applies to multinational forces is the same way it applies to peacekeepers, security contractors, rebel groups, and state armies. It operates on the principle of equality of belligerents. It does not enter into the understanding of which side of the conflict is just or not. IHL applies differently depending on whether an armed conflict is international or non-international. However, in most cases, when it comes to the protection of civilians, as being part of customary international law, it applies on all armed conflicts in a similar manner, regardless of whether there are so many ratifications of Additional Protocol 1 than Additional Protocol 2. I assume that you understand what are the Geneva Conventions are and their additional protocols. If there are some questions around that, then we would be able to answer them. But for purposes of coherence, I would assume that you understand those terms. The interpretation of whether IHL is being correctly applied depends on understanding the prevailing situation during the conflict at the time the incident that is the subject of interpretation occurred. Whereas all these three aspects of application of IHL, meaning the situation of armed conflict, the equality of belligerents, and the situation of war, being the basis for the interpretation of the compliance, seems to be straightforward, some questions remain unanswered and thus become the basis of controversy for legal interpretation and application. The challenge is that it is difficult, for instance, to argue that all combatants need to be taken in the same way. The terrorists to be taken in the same way as peacekeepers. It is difficult to recreate the situation of conflict. We would never know for sure the kind of scenarios that were going through the commander's mind at the time of launching an attack to be able to conclusively determine that that attack violated the laws of fighting or not, and to argue that indeed all parties to the conflict are equal and thus deserve to use the same tactics and as expected to follow the same rules. The nature of conflicts have changed, but rules are still the same the way they were adopted in 1940s and 70s. The principle of proportionality, for example, remains controversial. The prohibition of indiscriminate attack that cause excessive damage to civilians and civilian properties is a very difficult rule to observe and enforce because there is no uniform measures to use to be able to determine whether it has been respected. And as a footnote, it is also the case that understanding and interpretation of these rules also depends on who is interpreting, because we consider some belligerents as enemies, we sympathize with some victims and not others, and thus makes it difficult to apply. So let me talk about one more controversial issue before I conclude my talk. Louis Henkin asserted that almost all nations observe almost all principles of international law and almost all their obligations almost all of the time. Countries, combatants, in this case, will comply with international humanitarian law at different levels of compliance and during different times depending on their interests. This has nothing to do with whether a state is well developed or well governed, strong or weak. This is a realistic view. It is indeed also true that institutions such as International Criminal Court would contribute to weaker states respecting the laws of fighting, and strong domestic courts, for example, would enforce respect of IHL in domestic systems, especially in those countries that have a very good foundation on rule of law. But IHL will always depend, its respect will always depend on the consent of states like any other part of international law. In ancient times, the compliance with international law was linked to the belief that there was a higher law, the law of nature, to which international law was part of, as law that is common to all men. But we have passed that theological level of belief. We have also passed the level of seeing the laws of fighting as a contractual obligation between states. The Geneva laws have made laws of fighting, especially as in protection of non-combatants, applicable to all regardless of whether the enemy combatants do respect them or not, to whether they are fighting a just war or not. The failure to respect IHL, when you see conflicts in DRC, Yemen, Syria, Burma, you realize that the situation is depressing. This pushed me to go back to my class notes of year one to examine the characteristics of a war, of a law, and see if IHL has those characteristics, and if not, how much of it is missing, and to reflect whether IHL can be indeed called a law. It is believed that law is a law when members of a society to whom the law is directed act or behave in a manner that reflects that that is a rule. This is not to say that to be aware of that rule is equivalent to respecting it. Certainly, coercive enforcement of law through punishments is the most vivid and demonstrable incentive as to why we, as people, individually or collectively, respect laws. But this is not the only reason. Actors are concerned with their image. States or combatants, of course, I exclude those groups whose aim is criminal in nature, such as those that commit genocide, terrorists, or crimes against humanity, because IHL is part of their enemy. But other groups will see other incentives to respect the rules of fighting and protection of non-combatants as being part of their wider disciplinary measures in place rather than simply based on the fear of punishment. Even if for those states that do not respect IHL do so, or even those armed groups that do not respect the rules of fighting do so, their argument is not that IHL is not in itself a rule, or that it is not supposed to be considered as a body of laws. Their argument are either that they are observing those rules, and often they are either using their lawyers trying to interpret facts differently. We all want to live in a society or a world that is predictable, where there is a legal order to be able to predict what or how others will respond following to our conduct. Image of combatants is very important, and this is connected to legitimacy. So we hope that when we treat our enemies with dignity and respect, even if it is during the difficult situation such as a war, that they too will return the favor. I said this argument excludes those groups that are by nature designed on a criminal intention, such as indiscriminate attack against civilians. The lack of superior power to enforce IHL over states has also been discredited on the ground that even in domestic systems, states observe national laws when there is no any superior power in place than the state itself to respect those laws. If you take an example of how states lose in courts, in domestic courts, for example, you would ask yourself what kind of power a private individual has to enforce the state to respect a decision of the court. That is not because the state is fearing to be put in prison. We cannot argue that the duty to respect the laws of war is only dependent on the existence of a strong enforcing mechanisms, because the laws themselves, as you've heard, starting from the history, they are part of the universal traditions, but they are in themselves good to be respected. If you would take an example of a state respecting rules because there is a superpower above it that would enforce rules, I would want to use the example that the argument that is used by Anton D'Amato, who notes that no enough state soldiers and policemen to hold the guns on heads of us to respect the rules. Because at some point, those two would be tired and fall asleep, and then we would return to anarchy. So there is something more than the fear of punishment to respecting the rules than just existence of courts and bodies that would enforce it. I want to stop here. I think I've touched on a few things that would stimulate a discussion, and I will intervene in questions and comments session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And so we're going to take a few questions. I don't know if you prefer to do it standing or sitting, just in case.
I prefer standing.
So do we have questions? So I probably will take 3 and then 3, so that's okay? Yes, so any questions in the room? Oh, wow.
So let me ask you. Who agrees that international humanitarian law or international law generally is law? And maybe why?
Bonjour, hi, my name is Sophie Gagné, I'm from Université Laval in Quebec City. So of course it's international law is a different kind of law as intern law because there's no supreme hierarchical authority that enforces it, but it's still a law that was agreed upon by states and universally in the case of the Geneva Convention of 1949. So it is a formal law, a form of law, and I don't know. I can start on voluntarism and everything, but I think that's enough maybe for now.
Thank you. So that's how students see it. They see IHL or international law as a sort of law, not law. And one of the arguments is that there is no superior or an enforcement mechanism. But also something that I did not mention that we need to consider is that the Geneva Conventions have been ratified by almost all states. So if you want, you can see it as part of the domestic law. So if states are enforcing their own domestic law, why would it be difficult to enforce IHL? Any other question? I'm going to ask another question then.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm Yves Muhire. I'm not a student, but I'm interested in this topic. Before you ask another question, I want you to explain a little bit how IHL is applicable to non-state actors. Non-state actors like labor groups, terrorist groups, and they are not signatories to these conventions. Thank you.
As I said, the IHL is concerned with the effects and the suffering resulting from the war. The major difference between how the IHL differs from in treating different situations depending on whether the situation is of an international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict is mainly as in regards to the combatants. If, for example, during an international armed conflict, you cannot put under trial the enemy combatant that has been captured, for instance, under trial for participating in the situation of armed conflict. But when it comes to non-international armed conflicts, because the states were not willing to give powers to non-armed, to rebel groups, to have because of the principle of the monopoly of use of force, because states have the monopoly over the use of force. So to allow other groups than the state to use force is contrary to to that principle of exclusive use of force. So in that case, when it is a conflict between a non-state actor and a state, when individuals in that group are captured, they can be tried for using force, for the illegal use of force, because they are prohibited to, because of the exclusive use of force that is reserved to states. But again, the reciprocity that is expected between interstate wars, because of the equality between states and the sovereign between states, and this is internal civil war, that in itself poses challenges when it comes to protection of civilians, because sometimes the civilians are allied to these armed groups, but generally international humanitarian law, as it concerns the protection of non-combatants, applies on all conflicts, regardless of whether it is non-international or international armed conflicts.
As you know, these conventions are ratified by state. So when they are ratified by those states are bound by them. So non-state actors are not signatories. So how are they bound by these conventions?
That's an interesting one, but which I find it to be also not considering the basics of international law. Because when a state ratifies a treaty, that treaty is applicable on all members of that state. Okay? So, by extension, that's why if there is a rebel group in DRC that is involved in a criminal conduct and DRC ratified the Rome Statute, ICC has jurisdiction over that group by the extension that DRC ratified the conventions. So that is one argument. If those, because, are you getting what I'm trying to say? So not individuals. So if a state ratifies a treaty, that treaty applies on all of us. Certainly some people might be disagreeing with that treaty. But the mere fact that it has been ratified by the state, my opinion is that it should apply on all the members of that state, whether you're part of an armed group or not. But that is, I would say, a theoretical argument. The reality is that some armed groups themselves have come forward to recognize IHL. And some of them, there is evidence that they teach their combatants the elements of IHL and the duty to respect IHL. So there is the reality of the fact that they indeed themselves recognize the rules of international humanitarian law, but also by extension, if one was to enforce it, I don't see an argument of saying that we are not part of IHL, yet their states ratified. The question is, what about those groups that belong to states that did not apply, that did not ratify IHL? The same argument can be extended to states that engage in armed conflicts that did not ratify part of IHL. And in that case, we can go to customary international law. The customs of war, in that case, applies. And the customary international law, as you know, applies on all states regardless of ratifications, because they have been considered as part of the custom.
My name is Robert Polly. I work as a delegate in the ICRC across East Africa. Can I just add a little thing to what the doctor said, just to go on the bit about the non-state armed groups and whether they have an interest in adhering to IHL and IHRL, and what could their interests be in adhering to IHL. The ICRC works across all conflict lines. So we will work promoting adherence to international humanitarian law and international human rights law, not only with state armed forces, but also with non-state armed groups. And I've often been asked, whether we do that and whether non-state armed groups have an interest. And if you imagine that sometimes you look at armed groups and they could be tomorrow's government, and if you were promoting yourself, if I was, the chef of a non-state armed group fighting to take power, it would make sense that what I'm proposing to the population is a good and credible alternative. And the last thing, if I was the head of an armed group, I would want would be for my soldiers to be contravening the elements of IHL or IHRL. And so what we find is that very often non-state armed groups are very, very keen indeed to understand IHL and understand IHRL and ask the ICRC to help them to adhere to the provisions of IHL. And that is not surprising. I think back to my time when I was working in the British Army before I joined the ICRC, and I was in the Bosnian War, and part of my job was to sensitise the parties to the conflict in the Bosnian War on their responsibilities towards the Dayton Accord, which was the accord that brought to an end the Bosnian War. And people didn't understand it, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that non-state armed groups don't always understand the provisions of IHL or IHRL, and that is why it's good that they do reach out to us. And even if they didn't reach out to the ICRC, we would reach out to them. Because at the bottom line, as we know, no one can escape IHL. And indeed, I've got a question for the doctor, which perhaps you'd like to answer at the end. What states have not signed up to IHL? Because I understood that all states had ratified the Geneva Conventions. I know that some states have not signed AP1 or AP2, but I think all states have ratified Geneva Conventions. Therefore, all states, I think, have signed up to IHL, have they not? Yes. Good. Well, because I often get asked that question. And then sometimes people ask me, whoa, which countries have not signed AP1 or AP2, and I'm never too sure. But it's very, non-state armed. The only, interestingly enough, the only non-state armed group currently, I believe, around the globe that does not interact with the ICRC is IS in Syria. And we've had real difficulty in working with them, and they don't want to know. But we deal with everyone, apart from, I think, IS in Syria. So all the Boko Harams, the Al-Shabaabs, the ISILs, the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, we work and do our best to ensure that they understand what's expected of them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. My name is Arikiles Bosco. I am a student at Kigali Independent University, of course in the School of Law. I have a simple question which is about biological welfare. Because there are some biological toxins or infectious agents such as bacteria and virus, fungi with the intent to kill or incapacitate humans as an act of war. How international humanitarian law reflects. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, and maybe...
Can I take one more, or do you want to answer this one?
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Redempta Monaire. I'm from CCM, Center for Conflict Management. I'm a student in Genocide Studies and Prevention. My question is, as you've said that the IHL is also law, given that domestic laws enforce the application of IHL, then the concern is, how does this apply when it comes to the international customary laws? Thank you.
Sorry?
My question is, as you said that the IHL is also a law, given that the domestic laws enforce the application of IHL, the question is, how does this apply when it comes to international customary laws? Thank you.
My name is Mark Agawa. Literally, my question is, as you're talking about the enforcement, I would like to ask if the international humanitarian law has a specific enforcement body, like a body in charge of enforcement of the law. That's my question.
Dr. I guess we'll take the three and then you answer and then take more.
The issue of biological weapons, maybe you can take it together with the chemical weapons or or weapons that cause excessive suffering to the target or whoever that they come into contact with. Those are part of the prohibited forms of weapons that are not allowed to be used in situations of armed conflict. But there is interest of states that produce certain weapons in not ratifying treaties that prohibit those kind of weapons. The interesting case is about when it came to the question that was asked at the International Court of Justice of whether nuclear weapons are illegal, the legality or illegality of nuclear weapons. And the court, I would say, was divided. The judges were divided on that because they said that nuclear weapons, for example, are not, there is no law under international law that prohibits nuclear weapons. There is no law under international law that permits nuclear weapons. But those weapons should be used in respect of the laws of international humanitarian law, which is to not cause excessive suffering or excessive damage in relation to the military objective. And the conclusion that was not shared by many was that nuclear weapons, by their nature, of the destructive nature, they cannot respect the principle of not causing indiscriminate attack against civilians because of the widespread nature and the damage that they cause. But the basic principle to follow when it comes to the laws of fighting is to respect the principle of distinction and not causing unnecessary suffering. The principle of distinction requires that you direct attacks against the military objectives. And that attack should be aimed to achieve the military objective. So the attack that would result later in the suffering of people that is not contributing to the military objective is in itself against IHL. The question about international customary law and how it relates with the IHL in the domestic courts. I would say that international customary law is part of the sources of law, of international law. For example, there is treaty law, there is customary international law, and there is international principles. Those form part of the sources of international law. And in that case, customary international law in relation to domestic states, domestic systems, courts, for example, is mainly in relation to what it produces. So is it part of customary international law that civilians should not be targeted? That is part of customary international law, but it is also part of treaty law. Is it part of customary law that you shouldn't torture, for example, the enemy combatants? Torture is part of the treaty law, but it is also found in the IHL. So there are different sources of law that domestic courts can use either as part of international principles of law, as part of jurisprudence, as part of customary international law, or as part of the treaty law that states have ratified. The only difference is that customary international law its application does not depend on whether that principle has been ratified or not. It applies on all states so long as it has reached the level of the feeling that by acting in a certain way, states are respecting international law. So I didn't relate very well as a question of IHL, but it is more of a question of international law in terms of the sources of international law. One is treaty law, customary international law, general principles of law, and maybe jurisprudence and the doctrine, but the last two are more persuasive than binding. The last question is about the body, whether IHL has a body of rules, a body that enforces its rules. IHL is expected to be enforced by state parties. States that are parties to the Geneva Conventions have an obligation under the universal jurisdiction principle to enforce the grave breaches of international humanitarian law. And in that case, it is a responsibility of all those states that are parties to the Geneva Convention. But besides that, the international tribunals, starting with the historical one, the Tokyo and Nuremberg, and then you come to ICTR and the ICTY. You can go to the UN Special Court for Sierra Leone, the Extraordinary Chambers and Courts of Cambodia. All those, part of their sources of law, they include grave breaches of the laws of fighting or the Geneva Conventions. When you talk about ICC, for example, it has, the Rome Statute has codified the grave breaches as part of war crimes that reaches the threshold of the international crimes. So those are the mechanisms in place that enforce IHL. But as I said, being part of these mechanisms, especially being part of the Rome Treaty and being part of the ICC, for example, or respecting these conventions depends to a large extent on states' consent. And that becomes a hindrance or undermines the enforcement of international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much, sir. I would like to say something just about what my colleague Robert said. In DRC, I was discussing with some police officers, and then I told them we work with both sides, with the government and then even with the rebel groups. And someone asked me, how come you are friends with rebel groups, with bad people? How can you be friends with so very bad people? And the thing is, we are not friends, really. We work with them, we are not friends. And as you can see, some of our colleagues got killed in many situations in Nigeria and so. So we are not really friends with them. So it's a very dangerous work, and sometimes some of us have to pay with their life. And people ask whether IHL is relevant, is still relevant, whether people really respect the rules or not. I would like to mention that mainly, most of the media, the focus is on the breaches of the law. As you know, when something is wrong, you'll see it in the media. But when something is good, the media keep silent about it, right? So we have many situations, many conflict settings where the rules were respected, and then the media said nothing about it. For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, the rebel group arrested many soldiers from the government side, and then they were released many days after. But no media talk about that. So I would like us to keep in mind that we are aware of many breaches of the law, but when things are very good, when things are positive, it's of no use for the media. Thank you very much.
And maybe to understand why ICRC operates in those situations is if you could have elaborated on the principles of humanitarian principles. The principle of neutrality, the principle of independence, the principle of impartiality. The IHL has 7. Most of humanitarian agencies tend to follow 4 or less, but I think those are, even if the 4 are one we would call external and the 3 are more of internal cooperation for the operation of ICRC. But generally, the reason, as I said, it is based on the equality, on the treatment of all combatants as equal, because it would be dangerous for ICRC to go into the interpretation of who has good cause and not. In that case, you would not get cooperation, yet the intention is to limit the suffering of the war, not to support a cause in a conflict.
Thank you. My name is John Rukurwabioma. I happen to be a graduate student at UR in Genocide Studies and Prevention. I totally agree with the ideas of IHL. However, if we look at what is around us, we may have very tough time justifying it, or its success. I'm not here to blame the media. The media does an excellent job. They say the truth. Let me start with excessiveness of the damage. Who determines that? Because what we see around in Iraq, in Syria, some states will jump to that. There was excessive use of this and that. But what happens around somewhere else? Oh no, that is justified. I strongly believe that there should be a certain power, not Security Council for fraud, because its subjectivity has led most of us to dissociate ourselves from its ideas, more so by some of the leaders lately. You find that with that subjectivity, even getting a superior body that would monitor and enforce it is currently not that easy. I still say that IHL is needed. I'm not one. We don't have so many of Mother Teresa's around, but should have subscribed to this as well. We talked of just wars. The problem again is subjectivity in defining a just war. A just war. Really, if IHL was around, we were looking for you when all this mess happened here. We were around in so many areas. You are missing, Mr. British soldier. You are AWOL when we needed you most. I'm an X. Oh, X, oh, I see.
I'm a civilian humanitarian.
Okay. Keep on doing what you're doing. We really miss those kind of bodies with ideas that most of us, by the way, did I say that I'm a Christian? Huh? Then big chunk of Rwandans are Christians and Muslims, so we believe in superior powers. But we killed each other. So when you say that you're friendly to, no, you can't deal with FDL and say you are very neutral. Once they come to terms of what they've done, because it's business as usual, they haven't completed the job, then I can talk to you saying that you are very neutral. Partiality is very difficult, especially in this part of the region. However, I can take you to villages whereby unity and reconciliation has done quite a lot. But down there in the jungles of Congo, they haven't finished business yet. The threats, no state should threaten another state. That is really, if you tell me that, now we have a champion who has become a Rambo around, threatening states with warships all over, busting some of the states. So that should be deleted. It is obsolete nowadays. Threatening is the norm of the current state. Thank you.
I think he asked a lot of questions that I would want to respond to before I forget. One, I will start with the last one. And I think we should go back to the basics. For example, when we say that we have a law that prohibits stealing, it doesn't mean that thieves will not steal. They will steal. But that is not to say that there is no law that prohibits stealing. And another comment I would want to make is, at least with all the modesty that we have to express when it comes to cases of the genocide, ICRC is one of the courageous organizations that stayed in Rwanda. Not everybody, but at least if you want, there is a record of that. ICRC is one of the courageous organizations that stayed in Rwanda. Of course, with some individuals also staying on their own. but at least there is a record of that. So, what I will agree with you is whether IHL is respected and the interpretation of it and the subjectivity that is involved. The issue of excessive damage and I will explain how it is very difficult. States or combatants are prohibited from directing attacks against civilians or non-combatant and civilian objects. But states or combatants are not prohibited to launch or to attack a military objective when they know that doing so will cause either accidental or the American concept of collateral damage. When there is a likelihood that it will cause excessive damage, I mean, when it is going to cause the damage that is not excessive compared to the military objective that is intended to be achieved. The question then becomes is how many dead bodies are needed to say this attack was excessive or not excessive. Okay? So then we go back to the recreation of the situation of armed conflict, because IHL is expected to be interpreted in the situation of war, in the situation of the time the conduct was that is being interpreted was conducted. So in that case, it becomes difficult to recreate the situation of war when you are not there. Two, it is very difficult to know whether the commander was considering the tactical objective or the strategic objective. Whether the commander was about attacking this position to be able to cross to a next point, or if the attack was aimed to achieve the whole objective of the war. In that case, you don't have enough information to make the judgment. And it is considering two different values, human life and the military objective. So that makes it difficult, but then that is not to say that it is not possible to do, because there will be some incidents that will happen and any reasonable person will say that was outrightly criminal. And there are other incidents that will happen and people will say if any reasonable commander was in that same position, then the same situation could have been taken. But then the problem, and that applies to law generally, we never agree on that reasonable person. But that is the basic judgment that we follow, that any reasonable commander, if a reasonable commander was put in the similar situation, would that commander take the same decision or not? If the answer is no, then that goes to the conduct being excessive. So, yes.
Thank you. My name is Lifred Shimirwe from University of Kigali, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for organizing such a dialogue. But I have some questions about IHL, ICRC, and I would start by asking the doctor, and I don't know his name, but I would like to ask you people, how do you see the justice given by this IHL and international laws relating to Africans and us, who are seen as powerless sometimes? Sometimes I think that the justice given by these international laws, that's what I see. I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. The justice that are given by these international laws and these IHL that we're studying at school is a justice that is given in the interest of the justice giver than the interest of the justice receiver. I want you to prove me wrong if I'm wrong. And basing on what Muzei just said, we see Rwanda, this unity of this Commission of Unity and Reconciliation has done many things as far as this country is concerned. And as an African, I ought to say that it makes me question ICRC and these bodies that are working internationally to bring this thing called collective security and protection of civilians and civilian properties and bringing peace to the world. He said true. You have been to Congo for a long time. What happened? But I want you to assure me how far with the partnership with the big countries, with these states that drafted these laws, the Geneva Conventions, they drafted them, we're studying them, we're following them. How far, Doctor and Sir? I'm asking you with a purpose. You're Africans, right? I'm asking you this question with a purpose because I'm looking forward for a partnership in these laws. In the, they drafted them. When are we going to draft the Kigali Convention and it attracts the same attention as this Geneva Convention? Madame said she works for a neutral organization. I want you also to answer me. Is it really neutral? In as far as, how can I say it? I'm even using a language that is not mine. How neutral are you in as far as, doing what you say you do? How far are you impartial? And how fast are you strict on you might be doing good. I didn't say that you're not doing good. I didn't say that IHL is bad. It's really good. You did some very good things. ICC tried many cases, and they say most of the cases that went to ICC were brought there by Africans, and it's true. But I want to know how the time it takes for these international laws to do what it has to do. Is it really the time it should have taken?
I think I got your question, and I think I got his question, and this I think proves why I think this event is being organized, and I think many more events like this one should be organized. Before we came here, we should have started with explaining what is ICRC, what is its mission, and how does it operate. And this could have helped them to know how does it contribute to ensuring that international humanitarian law is respected. But just to say a few, IHL is not aimed at ending war. The purpose of IHL is not to stop war. The purpose of IHL is to limit the sufferings or effects of war. So I told you the first part of the laws of war, which is justice of going to war, and how the UN Charter prohibits the use of force or threat of use of force against the territory of other states in their international relations. But again, as the previous speaker said, this is not to say that laws are always respected. And that is what I said, that states will, a realistic view is that they will respect laws when laws are in their interest. Because we don't have any superior power above states to enforce international law. So the respect of international law depends on the consent of states. So the question of how ICRC is neutral, I will leave it to those who work for ICRC. But the understanding is that when a conflict starts, there are some individuals that need humanitarian assistance. Okay, there are some people who need treatment. There are some people. There are some people who need food. There are some people who are suffering because of the situation of armed conflict. And in that case, ICRC will not discriminate. Okay, it will not discriminate between people that are suffering, because they are all suffering. So if someone has lost a limb, whether you come from what one group calls a bad group and another one calls it a good group, they will both be treated. Okay? Because it is based on this principle of humanity. The principle of humanity, where it is argued that even if, let me ask you one question. If you were a soldier and you meet your enemy on the battlefield, would you kill that person when that person has surrendered?
Should I answer as a student of IHL? Or
No, answer no.
for the protection of my civilian population,
Yeah.
I might kill that person to save.
If someone has already been disabled, why don't you want that person to be treated? If someone has lost a limb. So those are the issues of IHL, but I think there is a need to distinguish ICRC from other international organizations and how their mandate, at least, because the reason I say ICRC at least has kept its neutrality is that even before ICRC personnel cannot be compelled to give evidence. They cannot be compelled to give evidence about the things they see in the conflict because they want to keep their position of neutrality. But the UN, for example, the UN agencies in situations of conflict sometimes have been compelled to provide evidence. And you know the case of Rubanga, when the case of Rubanga was almost collapsing, it was because of the evidence that was provided by one of the UN agencies, and the prosecutor did not want to reveal the source of information, but then the defense was that not revealing the source of information is undermining their ability to defend themselves. So that information was required either to be dropped or not until they reached an agreement that that information should be released. But it has not happened with ICRC. Probably I'm wrong, but with recent cases, maybe there is where ICRC have been compelled to provide evidence. But ICRC, because of their neutrality, they cannot be required. And that is one of the dilemma that the person who stayed in Rwanda of ICRC put himself in one of the interviews. He asked himself whether it was still moral for him to remain neutral on what was happening in Rwanda, because it was beyond the normal situations of armed conflict. I'm sure I did not answer your question. But those are the comments I could make on what you said. As I said, IHL, because it has been ratified by states, the responsibility is on states to enforce IHL. So, Rwanda and any other country have the obligation to enforce the respect of IHL, principally through the universal jurisdiction principle. It depends on how the principle applies. For example, for the case of Rwanda, it is when the suspect is found on the territory of Rwanda. So that person, if that person is suspected of war crimes that falls into the category of international crime, that person can be tried and punished in Rwanda for violating international humanitarian law with the grave breaches. But some other jurisdictions have broad universal jurisdiction. So some countries can indict individuals who have committed, who are suspected for having committed war crimes, even if those individuals are not found on their territories. So the question you are asking of why do states not prohibit, I will go back to the question I answered of saying the existence of laws and courts in a domestic system do not in itself complete or stop the commission of crimes. So we have laws in this country that prohibits criminals, but courts have a backlog of cases of suspected criminals. So yes, there is an enforcing mechanism. There are laws that prohibit it, that criminalize those conducts, but still criminals commit crimes, criminal conducts happen. Okay? That is not to say that the level of enforcement on an international level is very weak because of lack of a strong enforcing mechanism that would ensure that all criminals are punished.
So we are going to take really last round of questions. There are some people who have raised their hands. So I will only take 4 questions and we close. So that is you, sir, the lady himself, and the guy here, right? Thank you so much. Sorry. And then Joel will give the comments. Oh. Make it 5? Close it to 5? 5, we're good? Make it short, make it brief, please. Thank you.
According to my observation, you seem to be an excellent researcher in matters regarding these particular issues we are discussing here. I want to ask you, or I want to know, do you see any relationship between international politics or politics at length and international human law? Plus, if at all it's there, can you shed some light on the negative impact it has on the functioning of the international human law? 2, I want also to know the applicability or effectiveness of the international human law on states that do not possess effective government like Somalia.
Thank you. My name is Sangwa Rafiki Pacific, a student at Kigali Independent University. My question is this: does international humanitarian law apply to the state in the same manner? I mean, compare a theory to the practices. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm from the university, law student at the University of Windsor in Canada. My question is, because it's been a long time since the last sort of updating, in the face of climate change, where the environment is very vulnerable to be used as a weapon of war, and with the example of Syria, is there any motivation to sort of lower the threshold to engage, to trigger the available mechanisms, or is there an updating coming, like a 40-year update?
Once again, my name is Mark Agala from University of Kigali. My question is, you have talked about, like, that asked a question about the chemical weapons that are not allowed to be used within the wars. As a mere fact that chemical weapons have got a major influence on the environment, I wanted to know if the international humanitarian law also goes ahead to protect the natural environment.
Thank you. My name is Penny, a student at University of Kigali. My question is, Doctor, you mentioned that there is not enough men to hold guns on our heads so as to obey the laws, and surely that is the truth. So what would you say is the force to obeying laws, or to people obey laws, if not for the fear of punishment? Because in my opinion, most people do actually obey laws because they fear to be punished. And so what would you say is the force, if not for the fear of punishment? Thank you.
The first question was, do I see any relationship between international politics and international law? And if there is there an impact on the respect of international law? The straightforward answer is yes. Law is a product of politics, whether national or international. Go back to where laws are made. They are made in parliaments. Who compose the parliaments? Those are politicians. So law is a product of politics. But to say that law is a product of politics is not the same as saying that law is politics. Do you get the difference? To say that law is a product of politics is not to say that law is politics. But law is a product of politics. So we can go back to the basic question. How is international law made? We talked about the customary international law, that's one, but let's talk about the treaties. The treaties are negotiated between states, and those diplomats that represent states are politicians. Okay? And it is with those who hold a dominant voice in those negotiations that their views are, in most cases, listened to when the laws are being crafted. You can take an example of the drafting of the Rome Statute. US, France, Italy, each country had over 50 delegates in the discussions. Rwanda, I think, had 3, and most other countries had 1, or I was going to say less, because most of the people that were counted as part of those delegates from those countries were the ones that were considered as the technical support, who were also given by either universities or organizations that come from those countries. So you would find a country like Senegal represented by 10 people, 7 of them have been provided by FIDH, or they have been provided by another NGO, or are coming from a university. It is a university student or lecturer or researcher from the West. So in that case, the voice of the people that are in the room when the law is being crafted are the ones who are going to be reflected in the outcome of the treaty. But when we talk about the Geneva Conventions, most of our countries had not even existed as countries. You know that? Because this was in 1940, and our countries started getting independence in 1961-62. So they were not part of the discussions. So obviously they were not going to respect to include the views of those who were not there. And I don't think you can blame them because they were not there. Okay? So, yes, there is the respect of international law and who dominates in the interpretation of the international law. So this is a debate, I think, that is more broader than international humanitarian law. At least, as I said, international humanitarian law, whether you go to the conflicts, collective conflicts that happened in Rwanda, whether it was Rwanda fighting Burundi or Rwanda fighting Igisaka, or there was always a desire to have modulation. It was not a route, it was seen as something that is wrong to kill women. So those are the basic values that IHL adopted. And that's why they are applied in a restrictive manner. Because there is no justification, since the intention of the fighting is to overcome the enemy. There is no justification of causing damage that is not contributing to you achieving that objective. So, yes, as I said, international law and international, with the extension, international humanitarian law, those are products of international politics. Just like national laws are products of domestic politics. Does IHL apply in the same manner? It is expected to apply in the same manner, and it should be applied in the same manner. Then the question, maybe what you would want to ask is, are all incidents interpreted in the same manner? For example, if there is the killing of civilians in this area and the killing of civilians in that area, is it interpreted in the same manner? That is why I said these issues are also subjective, because it depends on who is doing the interpreting. But the basics are the same. Do not cause excessive damage that is not contributing to the military objective that you intended to achieve. I can give one, and this contributes to how difficult it is. There is a case of that happened. It is written in the book of Michael Sanders, when he tries to explain what is justice. And he gives an example of when the US soldiers in Afghanistan, when they were on a reconnaissance mission, they met a group of Afghan shepherds doing usual civilian work, looking after sheep. When they met them, they disagreed on whether they should kill them or not, because they did not have a rope to tie them. So out of the discussion, they said, okay, we have failed to agree, let's vote. They voted, and the majority allowed them to go, because these were civilians doing civilian activities. There were, I think, 4, if not 3 men with a young boy of 14 years. They let them go. After about 30 minutes, they were attacked by Taliban. All the all the group except one who was injured were killed, including the helicopter that came to save them was also shot down and all on board were killed. It is that only survivor who tells the story. So the question is, now you know the story. You can say, obviously, they should have killed them. Because it is not only the duty to protect the civilian, but you also have a duty to protect your soldiers during the conflict. So in understanding the protection of the US soldiers, probably killing these 4 civilians was proportional to the military objective they wanted to achieve. But who would have understood that that was a military objective after the conflict, when they had killed those people? Because it would be difficult to know that these civilians were going to cause, because they went and informed the Taliban fighters who attacked them. So it is very difficult in the situation of war for people like military lawyers to go after a conflict has happened to start judging that these were violations, these were not violations. Because the recreation of the situation of war is very difficult in itself. So that's why even the failure to respect the laws of fighting, sometimes the judgments that people pass are, to a certain extent, very subjective. So the Rome Statute protects the environment, and if you see the environment from the perspective of protecting, if the destruction of the environment is going to subsequently cause human suffering, on that extension, you can argue that IHL protects the environment. That is an extensive interpretation that I'm trying to make. If the environment, okay, the destruction of the environment is going to cause human suffering that is excessive to the objective that you want to achieve, in that case, you can consider the destruction of environment as a violation of international humanitarian law. Because the primary objective of IHL is to limit the suffering and effects of war. So whether it is caused by a chemical weapon or whatever means that is caused, so long as that destruction is going to cause human suffering that is excessive to the objective of the military goal that is intended to be achieved, it can be well argued that that is in violation of international humanitarian law. That is the same with so the two questions were the same. And then the question is, it's true there are no enough soldiers or policemen walking around us holding guns on our head that we should respect the law. So the question is, on which basis, other than the fear that we will be punished, that we should respect, that we respect the laws? I did not say that is not one of the reasons, but that is not the only reason. Yes, the fear of punishment is one of the reasons that people respect the laws, but that is not the only reason. Because some people see laws, because of what is provided in the laws themselves, as something good in itself. So you do not steal, not only because you will be punished, but because you know really that stealing is bad. So that is also a reason why people respect that law. We want also to protect our image. If you want to be respected as a rebel group in the community, and that example was given, you will try to act in a manner that the civilian population will accept you. That you are behaving in a manner that is not contrary to the agreed standards of fighting. That you're not terrorizing them, that you're not violating the laws of war. By not killing or by treating with dignity the enemy combatants, you are facilitating the desertion of your enemy into your ranks. So if you don't, every individual you arrest during the fighting, that you capture, and if that individual is well treated, it will encourage your enemy combatants to desert from that group and join you. And that is contributing to achieving the military objective over your enemy. So there are different other reasons as to why international humanitarian law is respected than the fear of being punished. And I end here. Thank you very much.
For the doctor. Thank you very much, doctor, for a great discussion. Before we close, there's a question that we're supposed to answer about the neutrality and the...
I'm a former police officer, and then we don't speak a lot, you know. Thank you very much, doctor, for replying to my question, to the question directed to me. And I would like just to add something to help for our neutrality. It's forbidden for any state in the world to appoint a staff in the ICRC. You know, states can appoint staff with the UN, for instance. So you can send someone representing a particular state to work in the UN and protecting the interests of the country. But for the ICRC, you cannot appoint any staff in the ICRC. So the ICRC recruits people privately, not going through any state. It's a private contract. For instance, I had to resign from the police before I can work for the ICRC. And I would like also to say, for the sake of neutrality and independence, it happens very often to the ICRC to refuse the funding from a country who is giving too much direction about how the ICRC will use all the money. For instance, if a country say, I will give you many billions, but the money should never go to the Palestinian, for instance. We say, okay, keep your money, we don't want your money. Because if you really want to be independent, if you are taking money from everyone without, any specific agreement, you may lose your independence, okay? So, and then last, we are not allowed to make a public statement regarding our finding during, if we go, for instance, to a prison, and then we see something that is maybe wrong. We go to the prison director, and then we give him the report. We draft a report, and then we share the report only with the prison director. We are not allowed to give the finding to someone apart from the authority in charge of the situation. That is very different from the way other organizations work. For instance, if you take Amnesty International, they are allowed to make a public report, but it's forbidden for the ICRC. We work directly with the authorities to try to see how we can solve the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to personally thank each one of you for attending tonight. We definitely do have more events like this one where we sit down and discuss and ask questions and answer them. And all those happen under what we call the humanitarian, which operates under the ICRC. We will reach out if we have an event coming soon. We normally do one every 2 months. And they happen either here or some other chosen venue. Just a reminder, it is also within the ICRC mandate to promote IHL principles. And we do that by all means in all aspects, with armed groups, with states, with authorities, with students, with locals, with everyone. It's within our mandate. So that also is part of keeping the neutrality, because we make sure that people respect IHL at all levels. Yeah? Now, for those who would like to know more about the ICRC just next door, you can reach out to us. You can have a chat with one of my colleagues. You can call us. You can come at the office anytime. Doors are open. We will answer your questions as much as you have them. Okay? Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Doctor, for answering the questions, for a good presentation, and for making sure that everyone understands and is satisfied with the answers. Without more delaying, I would like to wish all of you a very beautiful night, and we'll definitely reach out. Thank you so much.